The morning air was still damp from last night's rain, carrying the faint scent of wet asphalt and distant exhaust. Elisa stepped carefully over puddles, the plastic bag holding her cold lunch slapping lightly against her side. The badge on her chest, frayed at the edges, felt heavier than usual, not because of its weight, but because of the world it represented, a world she had no claim to. The Valley Technologies building loomed before her, a monument of glass and steel, reflecting the golden rays of the rising sun and the bright headlights of passing cars. Its mirrored surface seemed to mock the modest homes beneath the overpass, as if whispering, "This world is not for you." Inside, the lobby stretched like a frozen ocean of pale marble. Each footstep returned in an echo that made the space feel both grand and unwelcoming. The scent of strong, expensive coffee drifted from the reception desk, colliding with the bleach that lingered on her gloves. Elisa passed the guards with mechanical nods, their eyes never lingering, never acknowledging her presence. She had long ago learned the art of invisibility. The service elevator smelled faintly of metal and polish. She pressed the button for the 14th floor, where the company's creative heartbeat pulsed relentlessly. The doors opened to a world buzzing with tension, young professionals in crisp, designer clothes whispered in hurried tones, phone screens glowing against anxious faces, every sound amplified by the glass walls. The floor was alive with ambition, greed, and unspoken competition. "The cleaner's here," someone murmured, stifling a laugh. Elisa ignored it, bending to collect crumpled papers near the desks. A woman in a white blazer brushed past her too quickly, knocking over a cup of orange juice. The liquid spread across the shiny floor, threatening to stain the expensive carpeting. "Watch it!" the woman snapped, eyes sharp, as if the spill were Elisa's fault. Above the chaos, Adriano Valli leaned on the glass railing of his office balcony. Dark suit immaculate, expression unreadable, gaze fixed somewhere far beyond the floor below. Rumors and respect followed him in equal measure. The man who had pulled the company from bankruptcy, all transforming it into a technological powerhouse. To Elisa, he was untouchable, a figure as distant as the clouds above the skyline. At the corner of the room, a laugh erupted, louder than the others. Caio, the marketing director, leaned casually against the wall, his smile arrogant, eyes sharp. "You know," he said, voice dripping with mockery, "Adriano should charge admission. The cleaner on her knees scrubbing the floor is the only thing keeping this Monday from being unbearable." Laughter erupted like sparks across dry wood. Elisa felt her face burn but refused to look up. Every gesture, every movement she made was scrutinized, measured, and mocked. She had mastered the art of endurance, but endurance alone did not dull the sting of humiliation. For a fleeting moment, her eyes met Adriano's. No smile, no contempt, just a steady, penetrating gaze, as though he saw something beneath the surface, something no one else could. Her chest tightened. She looked down again, gripping the damp rag with fingers white from pressure. The clock ticked 8:59. The room seemed to inhale. The general meeting would begin in moments, a ritual of corporate power. The department heads straightened, laptops and tablets ready, their prepared speeches rehearsed to perfection. Elisa, with her bucket of water and wrung rag, remained near the emergency exit, the shadow she had always inhabited. The glass walls reflected the morning sun, casting golden streaks over anxious faces. Phones were adjusted, papers shuffled. A cough interrupted the whispering of keyboards. The space held its breath. Something was coming, the invisible thread of change that had yet to make itself known. From the corner, Caio smirked, raising his voice. "Let's see if the cleaner has any wisdom to share today." And, while the floor laughed, Elisa's eyes shimmered faintly, as if holding a truth no one could yet see. The glass doors of the meeting hall opened with a soft whoosh, admitting Adriano Valli into the suspended office, his presence immediately commanding the room. The chatter of executives quieted to murmurs. Phones were lowered. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to pause. Caio, ever eager for spectacle, seized the moment. He raised his voice just enough to carry to the first row, but loud enough that Elisa, kneeling near the emergency exit, could hear, I bet the cleaning lady understands loyalty better than technology, he said with a smirk. Perhaps she can teach us how to keep everything spotless, including our reports. Snickers echoed lightly from nearby desks. A few interns looked down at their laps, hoping not to be noticed. Elisa pretended to scrub a phantom stain, heart hammering, cheeks burning. She was invisible, but the world still weighed on her. Kaio leaned closer to his colleagues, his tone dripping with sarcasm. And since she's here, why not? Tell us, if you were the CDO, how would you convince our investors not to flee the next product launch? A ripple of laughter ran through the hall, phones raised discreetly, some recording, some pretending not to. Every eye, every whisper was a test. Elisa felt the weight of every gaze. She inhaled slowly, grounding herself in the rhythm of the floor, beneath her knees, and the damp cloth in her hands. A calm settled over her like a thin veil. She did not flinch. For a moment, Adriano's attention shifted from the projected graphs to her. His gaze was steady, unjudging, as though he were seeing something entirely different, something hidden in plain sight. The laughter faltered, the room's rhythm subtly altered. She lifted her head slowly. The faintest glimmer of resolve burned in her eyes. The interns stopped whispering. The executives exchanged glances, and the world seemed to hold its breath. Kaio, emboldened by previous mockery, grinned theatrically. Well, she doesn't even know where to start. The collective laughter surged, but it was uneven now, hesitant. Something in the air had shifted. Even the hum of fluorescent lights seemed louder, as if marking the anticipation. Elisa exhaled quietly, straightening her back for the first time that morning. The water-soaked rag was still in her hands, a simple tool against a world that had spent hours underestimating her. She opened her mouth, her voice low, steady, carrying an authority no one had expected from someone crouched on the floor. If I were the CDO, she began slowly, measuring each word, I would listen to those who use the products. It is pointless to shine in the display windows if the lives of the buyers remain stained. The words fell into the hall like a stone into still water. The laughter stilled, replaced by murmurs of confusion and intrigue. Even Kaio's smirk faltered, his fingers tightening over the edge of his chair. Lucas Wad, the intern who had always watched Elisa quietly, whispered under his breath, She's right. A subtle nudge from a colleague shut him up, but the seed had been planted. Adriano leaned slightly forward, silent encouragement in his eyes. Elisa continued, her tone calm yet unwavering. Companies focus on growth, on numbers, on launches, but they forget the people who carry the products home, who save for them, who rely on them. I would show that we understand their lives beyond the glass, beyond the ads, beyond the spreadsheets. Silence hung heavy. Every head turned toward her, not in mockery, but in attention. The interns dared not breathe too loudly. The executives shifted in their chairs. The room, once a theater of scorn, now held its breath, uncertain, waiting. Kaio attempted to reclaim the stage, waving a tablet. Let's see, then. Any ideas, yard cleaner? Perhaps a demonstration? But the room no longer responded to his provocation. Eyes followed Elisa's small movements, the damp rag, the careful folding of her apron, the faint tremor in her spine restrained by quiet determination. Even the light streaming through the glass ceiling seemed to highlight her presence. No one believed she would even try. But the silence that followed spread across the hall like fire. Elisa straightened fully, water dripping from the mop bucket onto the polished floor. She looked directly at Kaio, then at Adriano, and whispered just enough for him to hear. Sometimes, the simplest truths are the hardest to see. And with that, the room seemed to hold its breath, awaiting the next move, the moment that would tip the scales of respect and power forever. Elisa's words hung in the room like a delicate glass sculpture, trembling yet unbroken. The murmurs and giggles had ceased. Even Kaio, who had thrived on mockery, froze mid-smirk, unsure whether to scoff or swallow the unexpected weight of her statement. She lowered her gaze momentarily, fingers gripping the damp cloth tighter. The rag, soaked with spilled juice and water, seemed trivial compared to the ripples she had just sent through the room. Yet in that small act of simple truth, she realized she held attention, fragile, delicate, but undeniable. Lucas, the intern who had always watched silently, took a small step forward. His voice was barely audible, but it carried a conviction that startled even him. She's right. It makes sense. A few other interns exchanged glances, the whispering of agreement like a faint wind in the vast auditorium. They were small, almost invisible, but they were the first to notice the imbalance shifting. Adriano, still seated at the head of the table, remained silent, yet every line of his posture radiated attention. His dark eyes studied her with an intensity that made the room feel smaller, as if all light and shadow had contracted around this quiet confrontation. The silence he commanded was heavier than any reprimand Caio could have thrown. Caio, regaining some composure, leaned back, trying to reclaim control. Well, if the cleaner thinks she knows how to handle investors, maybe she should start by showing us a strategy. Any ideas, Elisa? The room tensed. Phones discreetly recorded her. Whispers almost paused midair, and the hum of the air conditioning seemed louder. The audience had not expected a response, yet here it demanded one. Elisa took a slow breath, letting the calm she cultivated, in years of invisibility, settle over her like a second skin. She straightened her back and looked around, meeting the curious, doubtful, and increasingly attentive eyes of her audience. Her voice, low but steady, carried through the room. If I were the CDO, I would start by listening, not to the graphs, the reports, or the presentations, but to those who live with the products, those who buy them, carry them home, rely on them day after day. The company shines in the windows, but if the lives outside those windows remain stained, what use is that shine? The words landed like stones into still water. The ripples moved through the room subtly, shaking the invisible scaffolding of arrogance that had built up over years. Even the senior executives, poised to laugh, paused. Caio's grin faltered. Adriano leaned slightly forward, elbows resting on the polished table, gaze steady. There was no mockery, no judgment, only a piercing curiosity, as though he were seeing a hidden layer of the world he had never considered. The room, once alive with derision, held a fragile suspense, waiting for what would come next. Elisa continued, her tone measured, calm, almost ritualistic. People aren't interested in slogans or bright displays. They want products that work, that last, that make their money worth it. They want to know that the company sees them after the purchase. Not just the profit. Silence thickened. Even Caio's attempts at commentary fell flat. The executives were listening, truly listening. Her perspective, born of observation and quiet endurance, resonated far deeper than any polished slide or rehearsed speech ever could. The interns exchanged glances, small nods of approval. One dared to whisper, She's not just a cleaner, she's insightful. Adriano inclined his head ever so slightly, the faintest acknowledgement, inviting her to continue. Elisa's chest tightened with the realization that she now had a voice. Not a loud, commanding voice, but a quiet one that demanded attention. She gestured subtly toward the charts projected behind the executives. Companies often focus on numbers, growth, launch dates, metrics. But numbers mean nothing if they forget the people who make the product, part of their lives. If I were in charge, I would show that we understand the lives of those on the other side of the glass. Only then does the product truly matter. The room remained still. Even Caio, now pale with uncertainty, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Some executives leaned forward, eyebrows raised, curiosity overtaking skepticism. The balance of power was subtly, almost imperceptibly, shifting. The projector cast Adriano's reflection across the polished floor. His gaze remained fixed on Elisa, unwavering, as though recognizing a force that had long been invisible to the world around him. And just when everyone thought they would break, something was revealed that no one expected. Elisa, still kneeling by the mop bucket, looked up one last time. The office seemed to breathe with her, the sunlight glinting off the glass, shadows bending around her small figure. In that moment, her presence was undeniable, quiet, strong, transformative. The interns, the executives, even Caio, were forced to confront a truth that was both simple and devastating. Power and respect do not always reside where they are expected. Sometimes they hide in the quiet, the overlooked, the underestimated. A sudden alert on Adriano's tablet caught his attention. He glanced at the screen, then back at Elisa. A faint, unreadable expression flickered across his face. "We need to discuss this further," he murmured, almost to himself. And as the murmurs of the room resumed, quieter now, tinged with curiosity, an invisible thread began to weave itself between two lives from opposite worlds, hinting that this encounter was only the beginning. The meeting hall was still heavy with the echoes of Elisa's words. The air seemed charged, as if the sunlight streaming through. The glass walls had suddenly carried a weight of its own. Every desk, every chair, every polished surface reflected a subtle shift. Something small, almost imperceptible, yet unmistakably powerful, had entered the room. Caio, once brimming with confidence, adjusted his tie, his jaw tightening. The smirk that had dominated the morning was gone, replaced by a flicker of unease. He leaned back in his chair, attempting to regain control, but the room no longer obeyed his cues. The interns whispered softly, nudging each other, and even some of the senior staff exchanged uneasy glances. Adriano, seated at the head of the table, watched her, dark eyes focused, unblinking. There was no judgment in them, only a deep, almost surgical curiosity, as if he were peeling back layers of reality that the world had long ignored. Elisa, still kneeling by the mop bucket, felt a calm determination settle over her. The room had grown quiet enough that she could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the slight rustle of papers, even the distant honk of cars on the street below. She straightened her back, letting the damp cloth hang loosely in her hand, her voice steady as she spoke again. "Growth and profits are meaningless if the people who rely on our products feel invisible. Understanding their lives, their struggles, their needs, that is where true leadership begins." The executives listened, some leaning forward, some blinking slowly, absorbing her words. There was no pomp, no pretense in her tone, only clarity. And clarity has a way of breaking down even the tallest walls of arrogance. A young designer, emboldened by Elisa's quiet authority, had whispered, She actually knows what she's talking about, even..." The murmurs carried weight now. Adriano inclined his head slightly, almost imperceptibly, a silent nod of approval. The shift in balance was subtle, yet palpable. The room, once ruled by mockery, was starting to bend toward respect. Caio cleared his throat, trying again. "Fine, but this is a board meeting. Do you really expect people to take advice from a cleaner?" Elisa met his gaze, calm and unwavering. She did not respond with anger or sarcasm. She simply let the truth hang between them like a suspended mirror. "The position you hold does not make you right," she said softly. "Understanding people does." The words were like a quiet earthquake. Heads turned, phones lowered. Even the interns who had whispered moments before now watched silently, captivated. Adriano's eyes never left her. For the first time that day, Caio's charm and confidence faltered completely. Outside the glass walls, the city continued its rhythm, cars gliding, pedestrians bustling, birds calling, but inside, a new rhythm had begun. One of observation, reflection, and a dawning awareness that power is not always where it seems. Elisa rose slowly, moving to a chair nearby. The water bucket sat quietly beside her, a silent witness to the transformation she had catalyzed. The executives waited, not in mockery this time, but in anticipation. It wasn't just skill, it was dignity. And suddenly, silence fell across the crowd. Adriano finally spoke, voice calm, deliberate, carrying weight without arrogance. "Elisa, continue. Tell us what we're missing." For the first time, she realized she wasn't just being observed, she was being heard. The room leaned in, every face, every pair of eyes, fixed on her. The invisible line between her world and theirs was thinning, bending, threatening to disappear entirely. Even Caio, who had thrived on derision, found himself hesitating, unsure how to reclaim the stage he had dominated all morning. He tapped his tablet nervously, eyes darting to Adriano, then back to her. The shift was undeniable. Power, influence, respect. None of it could overshadow the quiet force she had become. And in that moment, the air itself seemed to change. The sunlight reflected off the glass differently, highlighting Elisa's small frame with a golden glow, as though the world itself had acknowledged her presence. The office, once a theater of scorn, had transformed into a space of possibility. The balance was tipping. The underestimated had begun to rewrite the rules. A soft ping came from Adriano's tablet. He glanced at the screen, then at Elisa, a shadow of a smile flickering across his face. Subtle, unreadable, yet charged with meaning. "We need to talk." "Privately," he murmured, almost to himself. The room watched silently, aware that a private conversation between them could change everything, and as Caio's eyes narrowed, a flicker of panic crossing his face, it became clear the game had shifted. The office was quieter than it had been all morning. Even the hum of computers and air conditioning seemed subdued, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Adriano's gaze followed, Elisa with a precision that made her small movements feel monumental. Every detail mattered, the way her fingers gripped the damp cloth, the faint arch of her shoulders, the subtle calm in her posture. Caio, meanwhile, was unraveling. His charm, once impenetrable, faltered in the presence of something he could neither mock nor control. Every attempt at sarcasm fell flat. The usual audience of eager interns and executives no longer rallied behind him. He tapped his tablet, clenched his jaw, and finally, his facade cracked. Elisa, kneeling beside her bucket, had become the axis of the room. Her presence, once invisible, now dominated every eye, every thought, every expectation. She rose slowly, unhurried, letting the water drip from the mop with deliberate care. The sound echoed softly, grounding the room in a rhythm no one could ignore. "If I were in charge," she said, voice steady, carrying through the space like a quiet storm, "I would not lead from a podium or a spreadsheet. I would lead by understanding, by seeing the lives affected by each choice, each product, each decision, and I would ensure that dignity, the dignity of every person, comes first." Her words landed like stones, heavy and undeniable. The executives leaned forward. The interns held their breath, and even Adriano's normally inscrutable expression softened with acknowledgement. The room, once filled with laughter and arrogance, was suspended in reverent attention. Caio's eyes narrowed, the first real sign of fear crossing his face. "And you actually think you can speak to investors like this?" He spat, voice sharp, almost desperate. Elisa met his gaze, calm, unflinching. "It's not about what I think. It's about what matters to the people who matter most. If you ignore them, numbers mean nothing." A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Even those who had once doubted her now exchanged quiet nods of agreement. The balance of power had shifted entirely. Adriano rose from his chair, the motion smooth, controlled. He crossed the room to stand beside her, his presence amplifying hers rather than overshadowing it. His voice, calm but carrying the weight of authority, addressed the room. "Listen to her. Every word is a reflection of reality. We've been too proud to see." The executives sat frozen, stunned by the alignment of insight and quiet courage. Caio's fingers drummed nervously on the tablet. His face paled. The room no longer responded to his theatrics, and he realized, belatedly, that influence is earned, not claimed. Elisa, sensing the tension, stepped closer to the conference table. Her voice, soft yet unwavering, reached every corner of the hall. "You can have wealth, power, and strategy, but if you lose sight of humanity, everything crumbles. Leadership is not about domination. It's about connection." The silence that followed was almost tangible, a thick pause where arrogance met truth. Everyone could feel the weight of her conviction, the quiet authority that emerged not from title or wealth, but from lived experience, empathy, and courage. Adriano inclined his head, a subtle nod of respect. For the first time, the world saw not just a CEO, but a man capable of recognizing the extraordinary in unexpected places. But the final blow came not from power. It came from a truth everyone had tried to forget. The room erupted, not in laughter, but in recognition. Executives murmured agreements. Interns exchanged glances of newfound respect, and even Kaio slumped back in his chair. Defeated by the realization that influence without understanding is hollow, Elisa turned slightly, her gaze meeting Adriano's. In that moment, an unspoken acknowledgement passed between them, the recognition of shared vision, of power measured not in wealth or status, but in courage and clarity. She returned to her bucket, slowly wringing the rag, a silent icon of dignity and resilience. The once invisible woman had become the pulse of the room, the center of authority without claiming it. Adriano's hand rested briefly on her shoulder, a gesture small but monumental. He whispered, only for her ears, "There's more to see, and more to build." Kaio, realizing the tide had shifted, stared at them, powerless. The quiet strength of the underestimated had transformed the room completely. And in that suspended moment, everyone knew the world inside the glass walls would never be the same again. The meeting had ended, but the air in Valley Technologies was still charged. The echoes of Elisa's words lingered, vibrating through the marble floors and glass walls, a silent reminder that something fundamental had shifted. Executives walked slowly, heads down, murmuring among themselves. Even Kaio, who had once ruled with arrogance, trailed behind, the veneer of confidence stripped away by the undeniable truth he had just witnessed. Elisa returned her mop and bucket to the corner, her movements deliberate, calm, almost ritualistic. Every eye in the room lingered on her, some in curiosity, some in respect, and some in quiet shame. She didn't turn to look. She simply moved with the same precision that had guided her through every unnoticed hour in these corridors. Adriano, who had remained silent since her final words, finally approached. His dark eyes softened, a rare expression of warmth breaking through the usual restraint. "Thank you, Elisa," he said, voice low, steady. "Not just for what you said, but for having the courage to say it." Elisa paused, tilting her head slightly, almost shyly. "I only said what anyone would if someone bothered to listen." He smiled faintly, a subtle acknowledgement that spoke louder than words. "It matters because you said it," he murmured. For the first time, the invisible became visible. Colleagues who had passed her with indifference now nodded, respectfully as she moved past. The quiet dignity she carried was contagious. The arrogance that once filled the room seemed to shrink in her wake. Kaio walked by, attempting a composed expression, but his eyes betrayed him. He had lost the subtle battle of perception. The room no longer responded to his posturing. His charm had been eclipsed by quiet authority. Elisa paused at the glass entrance to the main hall. Her hand rested briefly on the polished wall, feeling the cool hardness beneath her palm. The reflection in the glass was more than herself. It was the symbol of resilience, of dignity quietly prevailing over mockery and arrogance. Before stepping outside, she left a small token on the reception counter, a neatly folded cleaning cloth. Simple and unremarkable to the untrained eye, yet emblematic of her presence. It was a gesture that spoke louder than any grand speech. Small actions carry meaning far beyond their size. Outside, the city glimmered with the remnants of a morning rain. Elisa raised her face to the gray sky, letting droplets wash over her cheeks, a quiet liberation in the rhythm of falling water. Behind her, through the glass walls, Adriano watched silently, an observer witnessing the emergence of something, both fragile and unshakable, a truth born in humility and courage. In the days that followed, subtle changes unfolded. Meetings reflected practical understanding. Campaigns accounted for the real experiences of customers. Adriano implemented adjustments inspired by Elisa's perspective, and the corridors, once dominated by hurried arrogance, began to echo with a softer, more human cadence. Elisa continued her work, but now with a quiet glow of recognition. Colleagues greeted her by name, rather than the distant title of cleaner. Lucas, the intern who had silently defended her, began collaborating on small reports. Adriano encouraged her participation in meetings where her insights brought clarity that no spreadsheet could provide. And yet, despite the attention, she carried herself with the same humility, her dignity intact, her presence never ostentatious. The silent acknowledgement between her and Adriano had become a constant. Unspoken understanding, courage, empathy, and clarity had transformed more than just a room. They had shifted a culture. And as they walked away, no one dared laugh again, for they finally understood what they had witnessed. The glass walls, which once reflected only ambition and arrogance, now mirrored a quiet revolution. The recognition that empathy and understanding could reshape even the most rigid hierarchies. As Elisa disappeared down the corridor, Adriano returned to his office. A single note rested on his desk, written in simple, elegant handwriting. Some truths are found where no one is looking. He picked it up, reading it again, a faint smile crossing his lips. Outside, the city moved on, oblivious to the subtle shift that had taken place within its tallest tower. But inside, something irreversible had begun. Weeks passed, and Valley Technologies began to change, almost imperceptibly at first. The glass corridors, once echoing only with urgency and ambition, now carried conversations tinged with curiosity, reflection, and empathy. Employees paused to exchange ideas, to consider the perspectives of those often overlooked. The culture of the company, once rigid and competitive, softened around the edges without losing its strength. Elisa continued her work, her uniform a quiet contrast to the polished suits and designer shoes of the office. Yet the way she moved through the building, her quiet confidence, left a mark on every person she passed. She smiled politely when greeted by name now, a small acknowledgement of recognition, a subtle claim of presence in a world that had often ignored her. Lucas, the young intern, had become her ally. He quietly brought her notes from meetings, shared insights she might find useful, and occasionally offered a timid smile of appreciation. It was a small connection, but one that symbolized the ripple effect of courage. Adriano observed these changes silently, often from his corner office overlooking the city. He had always been a man of strategy, a master of metrics, but he now saw something metrics could never measure: the power of insight drawn from lived experience. He began to implement new initiatives, campaigns that considered real lives, not just sales figures. Policies were adjusted. Marketing reflected human truths. The culture of leadership shifted. One afternoon, when the sky was clear and the scent of distant rain lingered in the air, Adriano found Elisa on the rooftop terrace. The city sprawled endlessly below, its pulse mingling with the wind that carried a faint saltiness from the sea. He approached quietly, leaving a respectful distance. "Do you know what I learned from you?" he asked, his voice carrying the rare softness he seldom showed. Elisa looked up at him, eyes tracing the horizon. She smiled lightly. "What?" "That companies are built of people, and that dignity, quiet, unassuming dignity, is worth more than any sale, any metric, any achievement." She said nothing, letting the wind carry the moment between them. There was no need for grand gestures or rushed promises. The silence spoke volumes, filled with understanding, recognition, and the unspoken possibility of something enduring. Back inside, the office continued its rhythm, but with a subtle shift. Meetings were no longer mere performances of authority. Voices previously unheard now contributed insights. Small, meaningful changes were implemented, and in corridors where laughter once masked derision, there was now an attentive quiet, a respect born from witnessing courage in unexpected places. Elisa continued her work, often unnoticed in her humble uniform, yet the company had begun to recognize the truth she carried. Empathy, attention, and quiet strength could transform even the most rigid structures. Adriano watched, sometimes smiling quietly, knowing that the impact of her presence would extend far beyond the walls of the tower. And when she walked past, the staff no longer whispered derision or mockery. They watched, some with admiration, some with reflection, and some with a newfound awareness that power does not reside solely in wealth or position, but in courage, insight, and the ability to be heard. In a world blinded by arrogance, sometimes a single act of quiet dignity is enough to change the course of history. The city continued to move, cars gliding beneath the glass towers, pedestrians weaving through the streets, life proceeding as usual. But within Valley Technologies, and in the hearts of those who had witnessed her courage, A subtle revolution had taken root, one that no spreadsheet, no graphar, and no decree could ever measure. Elisa glanced at Adriano once more. A faint smile shared between them, a recognition of a bond forged not through wealth or power, but through understanding. The sun dipped lower, casting long reflections across the glass walls, as if the building itself acknowledged the transformation within. The world outside remained vast and indifferent, but inside, two lives from different worlds had intersected. And in that intersection, something profound had begun. A quiet, unstoppable force that promised to echo far beyond a single boardroom. A single office act, a single day,